Welcome to our Wilberforce Institute webinar in the presence for Windrush Day in 2021. National Windrush Day marks the important contributions that people from the Caribbean have made and continue to make in the UK. On Windrush Day 2021, the Wilberforce Institute welcomed you on behalf of partners across the City of Hull to highlight the important migrant ties between this region and the Caribbean. Welcome. I'm Karen Okra, Chair of Hull Caribbean Stories Steering Group. The panellists include today Gifty Burrows, founder of the Africans in Hull and East Yorkshire project, Dr. Nicholas Evans, Senior Lecturer in the Diaspora at the Hull University of Hull, and Catherine Ross and Lynda-Louise Burrell, founders of Museumand, the National Caribbean Heritage Museum. And there will be closing remarks will be made with Councillor Aneesa Akbar, portfolio holder for the communities at Hull City Council. At any time during today's event, if you would like to present any of your questions, you can use the function on the right-hand side of the screen. I would now like to welcome Gifty Burrows, Chair of Africans in Hull and East Yorkshire project. Thank you.
Hello there. Thanks for that introduction, Karen. A little bit about myself. I've been in education for about, well, several decades, in fact, and I'm currently working as a freelance practitioner for inclusive histories. Today, I'm going to speak about the RAF Caribbean servicemen who trained in filing, and this was part of the African Stories project. Okay. The African Stories in Yorkshire project was originally conceived as a community project, exploring stories of people of African descent from 1750s to 2007. This followed the Wilberforce timeline, given that he's got strong links with this area, but this time the narrative was centred around Africans, as it should be. Can I have the next slide, please? These here are some of the themes that evolved and can be seen on the website. And this includes the sections, as I mentioned, on service personnel, with the RAF recruits on it as well, and that can be found there. Although many people continue to engage with the website, there's been a period where nothing had been added to the archives until I was prompted by an inquiry from the family of Gilmore Westcar back in July last year. This led to the revival of the RAF section. Gilmore was an RAF Caribbean volunteer recruit, and at the time of the inquiry, there was little mentioned of him on the website, except, well, not even a story, but his nephew was doing his own family research and came across Gilmore's name. And he was surprised to learn that there was over 4,000 other Caribbean recruits that could be found training in RAF Hummingbee Mooring filing. For the Westcar family, dotted around 3 continents, they were delighted that Gilmore was remembered by other people. His family then began to wonder whether there was a memorial in the area that they could visit. And as there wasn't one, I had to agree with their sentiment that there should be one. It seemed important that to acknowledge the contributions of so many men in this unexpected location. And this galvanised me to approach Scarborough Borough Council and Filey Town Council to request that this should happen at Filey Memorial Gardens, which is located in Murray Street in Filey. Next slide, please. Along with this idea came another one, and that was to start a new section where subsequent generations of families could share their memories, and for us as readers to gain an insight into understanding those volunteers as individuals. It became an opportunity really to reunite them on a page and to celebrate their contributions in a role of honour. The plan was also to link this to a memorial. So with the diligent work of Audrey Dugy, who has had a long interest in diasporan history, and particularly with the Caribbean service personnel, the task was started to list as many young recruits as we could find. And this is something that's never been done before because information is quite difficult to come by. But currently we've got nearly 3,000 of them listed. The significance of the RAF Hummonby Moor as a site, as a main training camp for many of the Caribbeans during that period remains something that's largely unknown for Filey's, it's part of Filey's own local history. But then again, it's not unusual as it took over half a century for narratives of World War I and World War II to include or even acknowledge the contributions of colonial fighters. And still now, the lack of recognition remains a subject that yielded an apology from the Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, as recently as April of this year, which is over 100 years later. This is shocking, given that many would have left their existence of safety and would go into the unknown to aid Britain. In fact, during World War II, conversations about recruiting colonial fighters started almost as soon as war itself was declared. Can I have the next slide, please? This is an illustration, well, a map that illustrates the extent of the Caribbeans, or as then was called the West Indian colonies or West Indian islands. It was on the 31st of August 1943 that there was a public announcement by the British government about their intention to open up applications for recruitment in the West Indian colonies for the RAF. Before this main recruitment drive, there was only about 400 young men that had been recruited to join the RAF as aircrew. By September, an advert had gone out on the Kingston Gleaner. They found that soon the prospect was so popular that over 3,000 applied for an initial target of 2,000. At the start, the trades that were offered were that of mechanics, armourers, carpenters, equipment assistants, flight mechanics, teleprinter operator and wireless operators. Records in the National Archives detail the planning phase. The intention was that there would be a need for some rudimentary training on the island itself before the recruits would then be sent to England, where they would start their disciplinary training in earnest. It was understood that the contrast in the climate would be an issue, so the recruits were not to be sent to the north or to Scotland. In fact, initially, Nassau in the Bahamas was considered as a training base, but this was discouraged on the basis that officially or unofficially there existed a colour bar, and the thought of having so many West Indians on the island was deemed undesirable. And also they soon discovered that the existing facilities would not support that prospect anyway. So the initial training then in the West Indies was to last for about 3 weeks. But the reality was that it took a lot longer than that because of the issues of getting ships for their passage. This training comprised of elementary drills but with no firearms, lectures on the RAF, training for physical fitness, discipline for morale. This was then to be followed by a period of about 8 weeks in the UK before they moved on to their allocated trains. Interestingly, the advice back to the administrators was that the West Indian recruits were to comprise of no more than 10% of a unit, and they were not to be sent abroad. Next slide. This shows some archival text, and the first point I pulled out relates to the criteria for selection process, and it states that the language question also needs to be considered. A lack of knowledge of English would be a bar. Now, this puzzled me because at the time, English was and still is the national language for the British West Indian Islands. Many would have spoken with dialects with a smattering of patois, but in fact that maybe they didn't have the received pronunciation of their recruiters may have influenced their perception of the recruitment's capabilities. And undoubtedly, the candidates would have had different educational opportunities. So it would have meant that they had different written language skills, but one cannot assume that that is what that statement means. There was meant to be no colour bar, but reading the second point on the slide may lead you to a different conclusion, because if that was really the case, then there would be no need to have the reminder that once the recruits were judged suitable by their commanding officer, the closing of any trades to regular West Indian as a class is unnecessary. This suggests that until this message, dated 15th of October 1946, that it would be fair to assume that the opposite was true. Clearly, not all trades were accessible to everybody, even in times of war, because this statement was after the war, and presumably the authorities at that point were thinking about what the new armed services or armed forces might look like. So during their recruitment, in actual wartime then, the recruits were prohibited from joining certain trades. For example, that of a cook, a butcher, a chiropodist, police, many dental and many medical trades as well. The reason behind these restrictions are better understood when you learn that they were concerned that such trades would bring them into close contact with patients, and sometimes under embarrassing circumstances. This would explain then why other trades, such as that of massage therapist, mental health orderlies, special treatment orderlies, and dental clerk orderlies were also off limits. So even in times of war then, it seems that colonial subjects couldn't go too close or see the vulnerability of their fellow recruits. So even certain jobs, even if certain opportunities such as a dental mechanic was available, that would have been deemed all right, presumably because that meant they wouldn't need to go too close. So, and jobs that they had prior experience of, such as pharmacy dispensers, radiographers, lab assistants, even then, those were restricted to the recruits, presumably because that was about status and those were deemed to be professional roles. There is some irony to the gymnastics of trying to make judgments based on racial features in the Caribbean, as demonstrated by this very telling statement that advised on what might be expected. And it says, locally enlisted Caribbeans were not by all means coloured men, and it was probable that some had European physical characteristics. This is perhaps a good time to be reminded that West Indian Islands included the British Honduras, which is now Belize, and British Guyana, which is now Guyana, which are on the mainland, and are made up of people who are from many ethnic backgrounds and ancestral mixes, including Africans, Europeans, Chinese, Indians, and other nationalities, as did many of the other islands as well. Can I have the next slide, please? On their part, what motivated these young recruits were their desire to contribute to the efforts of the mother country. They also wanted to avoid the rumoured prospect that a German win would mean the return of enslavement, and they also wanted adventure and employment. The first contingent of West Indians consisted of nearly 2,000 men, and they were in two groups or penny packets. This was partly due to the logistical difficulty of transportation in wartime, and also due to the precariousness of the journey with the possibility of being torpedoed. 1,000 recruits arrived at the beginning of June 1944. Their troopship HMS Esperance landed at Liverpool, and they were greeted by an RAF band and the Secretary for States for the Colonies, who at that time was Oliver Stanley. Their journey had been traumatic, with some suffering from seasickness, as well as the threat of being sunk en route. A few weeks later, in July, a further 950 men joined the first group in Hummonby Moor. They arrived at Glasgow on HMT Harrower with the same fanfare. Now, the second contingent of about 1,935 docked at Greenock in November 1944, and they were met by the same warm welcome, but with no dignitaries this time. There was a third group who landed in March 1945, but they didn't train at Hummingbird, they went straight to Melksham. The West Indian presence in Filey must have been something of a surprise to the local population, as it was quite remarkable for a small place like Filey to have hosted thousands of Caribbean servicemen who did the initial training there before being moved on to their designated trades. It was astonishing for the villagers to see that number of troops, considering that for many, they had never seen a black person, and more accurately, in fact, men of colour, because they came in every shade, but nevertheless, they spoke English with a different accent. And this quote from the website gives some insight. Ted Bradshaw, who was a young man of 26 in 1944, remembered that the West Indian airmen used to attend Reeton Chapel on a Sunday. My mother and father used to entertain them, and so did other people in the village. They were thousands of miles away from home, and some were very lonely. They used to have supper at the chapel and a good old sing-song. We enjoyed their company because they were happy-go-lucky lads. Next slide, please. For the new recruits, life on the Filey camp must have been quite a culture shock. There were dubious behaviour by some of the locals who were rubbing the men's hair for luck, but in the main, the recruits were well received, as the previous quote illustrates. The minimum age was supposed to be 18, but many of the recruits were much younger than that, with some as young as 15, I've been told by some families. And drawing your attention to the young man on the right at the bottom, who is Kenneth Forbes. Now, he looks like a young person in dressing up clothes, but in fact, he was a young recruit of just 16 years old. Next slide, please. The accommodation started off as Stu of Billy Bunting's holiday camps that were built in the summer just before the war, but this was soon handed over to the government, who by spring 1941 had made it ready as RAF Hummingbird. It was an ideal location because it had a railway station, which would have helped with transportation. Today, that has reverted back to the holiday camp known as Primrose Valley and Bay Resort, but then it comprised of 52 rows of chalets, and they all had to have the glazing blacked out, so electric lighting was needed throughout the day. The existing boating lake was tarmacked, well, was excavated first and then tarmacked and used as a parade ground. The lack of heating in the accommodations, coupled with the wintry conditions of the East Coast, meant that many felt the cold badly. Alex Eldon, who came on the 12th of November 1944, saw snow for the first time when he woke up on Christmas morning. He also recalls that the men used 6 blankets with their greatcoats on top and every method to keep warm. Unfortunately, some succumbed to respiratory illnesses, such as bronchitis and pneumonia. Indeed, there were several deaths, including that of Byron Martin and Wilfred Octavius Dorns, who were buried in the Commonwealth war graves. 19-year-old Martin died of meningitis on 7th of August 1944, and 24-year-old Dorns of pneumonia on 17th of January 1945. Both were likely transported to one of the many military hospitals in North Yorkshire before they died, which explains their burial in Stonefall Cemetery in Harrogate. Other sad occurrences include Jamaican Patrick Constantine Marshall, who trained as an aircraftsman second class in Filey in the summer of 1944. He's buried in Harrogate following a flying accident, and sadly a month later, under very similar circumstances, a London-born air gunner, Vivian Florent, died and is buried at Pocklington after he came down at Seaton Ross in East Yorkshire. When demobbed, the men were given small payments of typically £25. And although very few stayed in the RAF and some did actually later rejoin, like John Crawford, After the war, most of them were repatriated back to the Caribbean, where little was done to help them settle back in and find employment. Within a few years, a number of the ex-RAF men returned to Britain, even before the Windrush was to sail. The men themselves were changed by their experience in the forces. They had seen the potential for change and opportunity, and they were disillusioned with the lack of suitable employment back home. It is clear from capturing some of the stories of the many ex-RAF men that they had to make, well, certainly when they came back to settle permanently here, they made further important contributions to British life. They had to make choices that couldn't have been at all easy. Some paid the ultimate price, and some couldn't ever see their family because of the financial choices that they had to make. And some returned when it was too late. And many of those stories can be read on the African Stories website. Next slide, please. On Sunday, 11th of June, 1994, around 40 men came together with the townspeople for a reunion at Filey. Since then, this history has been forgotten, and certainly a commemoration in Filey is overdue. But then that brings us into the present. On 28th of May this year, nearly a year after I contacted Scarborough Borough Council, who are the administrative bodies of Filey, Filey Town Council sat, discussed the proposal, which until then had had favourable reception, and declined the request. Instead, they want to have an all-allied commemoration. This misses the point of the story, in that nearly all camps would have had allied service personnel. But as far as I'm aware, only Filey had over 4,000 men of one region who left their homelands voluntarily and volunteered their services to come to the aid of Britain. Most allies are not volunteers. They were either conscripted or displaced from their homeland. I would hazard a guess that the French, the New Zealanders, the Australians, and the Poles did not have to face the same level of prejudice and adjustment as the Caribbeans did. Nor would many of them have faced the same level of disruption that was to follow them into the Windrush scandal of today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gifty. That was lovely. It just goes to show that the work that you're doing really tells a story, the true story of what people have gone through. I would now like to introduce Catherine Ross and Lynda-Louise Burrell, the founders of the Museumand, the National Caribbean Heritage Museum. Welcome to Wilberforce seminar. Thank you.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Hi. Happy National Windrush Day, everyone. Just thought I'd say that. I've said it a lot of times today, and I get happier and happier the more I say it. It's a great day, and I'm glad to be doing something special during it. But to tell the truth, I started this morning not with my usual bowl of cornflakes, but with a good Caribbean breakfast, which was made up of cornmeal porridge. Very Caribbean. Delicious. Okay, and all day I have been doing things that remind people, or I can use to tell people about Caribbean culture.
Just to jump in, I'm Lynda-Louise Burrell, Museumand's creative director, and this is Catherine Ross, our founder director, and also my mother.
Hi. Right. Well, Museumand is, you may say, an interesting name, and that's because we are a museum and more. We don't just do exhibitions, but we do lots of heritage events, and we create films, we have a TV show, and so on. Why I'm telling you this quite early in the presentation is because it's important that people know about the Caribbean contributions to British society. And so we don't want to do it just in one way. We want to do it in as many different ways as we can to connect with different kinds of people and different age groups. And so we tried to make our telling of the story of the Caribbean contributions to the UK a fun and a learning experience that people want to get engaged with. And that's why we're glad to be part of the project here in Hull, which is called Hull Caribbean Stories. But like I say, as a museum, what we really excel as, the two of us, is telling stories. We tell Caribbean stories. We tell the stories of the achievements of Caribbeans. We want to counter the press that seems to delight in telling negative stories about Black people. We've been here 70 years as part of, over 70 years as part of the Windrush. But as a story we've just heard before, we go back a long way in making a contribution to the UK. This needs to be known and it needs to be shared. And it needs to be known and shared because we've got new generations coming up. And if things are not told in the school curriculum, then we have to find alternative ways to do that. But I have to say there is light at the end of the tunnel. Schools are taking up the challenge, and we work alongside many schools around the UK, not just in Black History Month, not just for Windrush Day, but all year, trying to help young people to know that Caribbeans have been here and Caribbeans and British people have a shared history. We have to counter a lot of times the words that our history are hidden, they're untold, they're overlooked, and they're misremembered. So we have exciting moments when we fill the gaps in people's knowledge about these aspects of history. We tell stories not just about the events and the achievements and things we've done, but we also talk about individuals because we want to inspire and motivate. Now, hearing the story of those soldiers a little while ago is not just inspiration for Black people, it's inspiration for all people against the odds, despite difficulties. That's empowering, and that's what we want people to know. But what we want people to know is we were there. One of the things that we have to do in telling the story is to challenge the dominant narrative, the story that's generally told. We have to disrupt some of the narratives that we hear. Not like that at all. No, no, no. And so we correct and we retell. And that's what I say, we retell it in exciting and different ways.
It's also about telling the whole truth as well. And it's so disappointing when you hear about historians telling stories and they're missing half of the story out. So that's something that we always try to champion, is telling the whole story, the good, the bad, and the ugly, just so people get the truth of the matter, especially, you know, for the younger generation to go on and spread and tell that story themselves.
Right. And like every other museum, we have a whole range of artifacts. And it's one thing to tell people, but when you show them things, it makes more sense. They get their aha moments and they say, now I want to know more. Now I fully understand. Now I can change my behavior. Now I can change my views and attitudes, because they can see, and people can see, they stand a stronger chance of changing, of acting more responsibly.
It's really important to tell and share stories in ways that people want to hear them, can understand them, can digest them. So it's really important that when we tell our stories, it's all about being imaginative, being exciting, and really engaging with people. And like Catherine was saying, it's not just telling Black people the Black stories, it's about telling all people, all stories, so people can have a better understanding of those stories and of each other.
Right. And because Caribbeans have been here for a long time, it's natural enough, and there's a great lot of love stories that we've picked up along the way of different groups falling in love, marrying, starting families, or just being in relationships with Black people. So our stories are not just for people who are dark like me. It's for white people, and it's for those that are many different shades of brown in between. It's all about our shared history. And if we don't tell it, then the new generations will not know that. And they will know they look a little darker than most people, but won't understand why. And they won't know their history that will make them stand 10 feet tall.
It's even depicted in the illustration you can see on the screen that we had commissioned by illustrator of Caribbean heritage, Danny F. You know, even black people that came from the Caribbean became in all different shapes, sizes, colours, because we are a melting pot of lots of different countries and cultures.
Right, but I started sharing and saying Happy Windrush Day. Why do I do that? Because if I don't do it, who will? Today is National Windrush Day, and we've got to shout about it. If we start the ball rolling, then other people will. But as I say, it's our shared history, so we should all be wishing each other a happy National Windrush Day. We have to, as a people, stop being at the back. We have to blow our own trumpet. And when we do that, we have to give a big thank you to our ancestors, the people that arrived here, either as the soldiers, as we heard about, or as the Windrush generation, and what they had to put up with. We thought we were being invited into an environment that would be accepting and sociable to us. But what we found in those 73 years is that we have been, for the most part, in a hostile environment. I use that phrase now because it has become a phrase that everybody's using in relation to the Windrush scandal. But from the moment we landed on the shores as the Windrush generation, it was a hostile environment because the government themselves said things like, let them come, they won't last more than a winter. Well, we've been here 73 winters. That's because we're strong, resilient, hardy people, and we don't give up. And not only that, they didn't find us accommodation for the most part for us to live. So our first homes for many were either in things like air raid shelters, or they were in the underground stations, or 2 or 3 people lived in 1-bedroomed house. But don't worry about that, because what's happened is we've moved from 1-room accommodation to many Caribbeans having worked hard, saved hard, and now own their own homes. We've also moved from the manual, working on the railways, working on the buses, working in the factories, to where we work in many white-collar jobs. We've got university lecturers, for goodness sake. We have MPs and lots of councillors.
Royalty.
Yeah, and a lot of people working the Queen are employed. In the early 60s, it was said that our children, Caribbean children, were educationally subnormal. 2 things have happened since then. One is that a lot of those people have now become authors. We collect almost as many of the books that are published by Black people as we can as a museum. We want to say, look what we achieved. And you said we were educationally subnormal. We have had poet laureates. We've had writers in residence. We, who they said, were educationally subnormal. But we haven't been selfish. We have passed on a lot. We've passed on a lot of our traditions to British society. We've passed on our traditions of hairstyling.
1 second. Did we pass that on, or was it culturally appropriate?
Okay, it's been culturally appropriated by others, our hair plaiting, and they changed the names of it. In my Caribbean island, it was called cane row. In the States, the plaiting was called cornrow, and nowadays the general word is braids. I only resent that because I want people to say cane row, and then I'll tell them the story about when we were slaves. I'll tell them why we plaited our hair that way. and so on. I want opportunities to tell my story. About beauty, when I came to England as a child, because black skins are sensitive, we used a lot of cocoa butter and aloe vera for our skins. And inevitably, children in the playground or children in my classroom would say things like, I can smell hot chocolate. And they know, because I tell them umpteen times, it's cocoa butter, we use it, keep our skins supple and gorgeous and feeling good.
They still do like my day, whenever you go swimming at school. What's that smell? Smell like chocolate.
But now, in the top brands of all beauty products, what do they use? Cocoa butter or aloe vera. So things that we were teased about, they are now regular users of. We have helped change the face of Britain, even though it has been a hostile environment. We need to tell our children about these things because they need that for their sense of esteem and identity. If they knew what their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents have contributed to this country, they can then counter all the teasing, or all the stories, another word for lies, that they have been told about our history and our heritage. They need to know they should be like me, 6 feet tall. We also need to do a lot of talking about our culture and the Windrush generation, because the more we talk about it, all the services and agencies that look after older people will know it is important that they address our needs. I remember when the first lot of Caribbeans were taken ill in the 50s and 60s and went to hospital, they were not allowed more than 2 people at the bedside to see a person who was sick. That may have been the norm, but what Caribbean family has 2 people, you know, there's
22 more like.
22 more like, who want to go and see their people. And it was very difficult to be able to show your family support because you were so restricted in that way. So we need people to know that because of the family structures, different services need to adjust. And unfortunately, because of COVID last year, that again was another steep learning curve for the health service.
Now, what we want to say is that we're coming to Hull to start our Caribbean Stories project. And even though in Hull, you know, you might walk down the street and see the odd black person and a few brown people, but Hull has a long tradition and a long history with black and brown people, even further past back then the Windrush generation. And we want to bring those stories to light. And what you can see on the screen at the moment is the book that we wrote last year in lockdown, but we're actually going to be printing that this year and giving it out to people in Hull free of charge if they go to Hull libraries from the 5th of July. And in there, the book's called 70 Objects and Things, spelt with Jamaican patois. And it's looking at 70 things that Caribbeans from the Windrush generation think it's really important that everybody, whether you're Caribbean or not, know about our culture. So it's a really fun book. It's a book that has music, it has stories, sayings, rhymes and riddles, that sort of thing.
And games we played in the Caribbean, all sorts.
So, you know, you can go and listen to different music in there by going on to YouTube and putting the links in. So it's really interesting, it's really fun, it will make you laugh, it will make you cry in places, it will make you remember and reminisce. So that's going to be our starter to start celebrating Caribbean culture in the whole area. And from there, we're actually going to have an exhibition that accompanies the book that will be in Hull museums later on this year. And we're going all the way through to the end of the year, October, November time, where we'll be doing lots of activities and events that will be supporting the book. And we've been working with some great partners, including Hull Libraries, museums, Wilberforce Institute and Hull University, and of course Hull Council, who've been very accommodating and helpful to us. So I hope you come and visit the exhibition when it goes up. I hope you get invited back to talk about that more once it's actually going to be coming out. And hopefully when you see us on the street in Hull, come over, say hi, introduce yourselves, tell us your story. Even if you're not Caribbean, but you know a Caribbean person, you have something to share, you have a question even, come over, get involved, and it's been really nice chatting to you. Thank you so much. See you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lynda-Louise and Catherine. That was lovely, and Hull welcomes Museumand. I would now like to say Happy International Windrush Day to everyone, and Catherine and Lynda-Louise, and welcome Dr. Nicholas Evans, lecturer in Diaspora at the University of Hull. Welcome, Nick.
Thanks, Karen, and it's good to go last if not least. But anyway, it's yeah, delightful to be able to speak to you on this Windrush Day, especially because here in Yorkshire, but especially in Hull, we've been a bit reluctant or reticent to celebrate the Caribbean story, in particular the Windrush generation's contributions to our area. Something we hope this present seminar today has remedied. Today I want to talk about a piece of the jigsaw which I've not yet finished. It's work in progress, but I want to share with you, so hopefully people in the audience either today or if you're watching this on catch up will be able to actually engage and expand our knowledge about the forgotten stories of the Windrush connection with this city. 22nd of June 1948 was a pivotal turning point in the history of Britain as an island nation. Still reeling from the social, economic and political devastation of the total warfare, her towns and cities across the length and breadth of Britain turned once more to the men, women, but also the children of Britain's far-flung empire to help rebuild a new vision or version of Britain. If, to paraphrase Winston Churchill, the Second World War had demonstrated our finest hour in standing up against the racial injustices of Nazism, it was followed by a far uglier episode in our island story. Whilst Britain had made the right moral judgment to help annihilate Hitler's abhorrent worldview, peace provided a new breeding ground for racial discourse that scourged the country and which intensified during the Windrush generation. The story of the arrival of the so-called Windrush generation strengthened ties between Britain and the Caribbean, but it also bolstered an unequal partnership built upon centuries of inequality. Britain may, in a fit of moral consciousness, have abolished the slave trade in enslaved Africans in the early 19th century. It later chose to end chattel slavery on her Caribbean islands, where enslaved men, women and children toiled in unimaginable conditions. Yet the legacy of this unfair partnership from the beginning was a paradox that we need to remember on this day and every day of the year, as Catherine and Louise have just noted. For whilst we waxed lyrically about freedom fighting during the Second World War, as a society we did little to stop the racism that had enabled it and speak out against the structures that could have helped the hundreds of thousands of Britons moving from our Caribbean islands here to the Big Island and to make their stay more pleasurable and more tolerant. Despite such injustices, the wartime loyalties of tens of thousands of people from the Caribbean, as Gifty Burrows has just eloquently explained, brought this region into the minds of former combatants when Britain appealed to the Caribbean after the Second World War for people who could help rebuild war-torn Britain. Passenger lists detail the destinations of all those seeking to permanently settle in the UK from, to quote, beyond the seas, as using contemporary parlance, including people emanating from Antigua, Barbados, Jamaica and St. Kitts, which we include Catherine, who we've just heard from. Whilst the destruction of passenger arrival lists after 1960 has been the focus of much debate last year, those records that have survived, i.e. those before 1960, the focus of my attention here, enable scholars and those interested in the Caribbean story to imagine a forgotten story of Windrush that many hoped to have established new lives, rebuilding war-torn places, including Hull, rather than London, which has dominated the attention of Windrush discussions. I speak today not as an expert of the Caribbean. There are many in the audience who have far greater expertise in that area. Indeed, my colleague and our director at the Wilberforce Institute, Trevor Bernard, cannot be beaten when it comes to the Caribbean. But instead, I speak to you as someone who spent a career looking at the migration of people and how that shaped Britain, especially those coming to our own patch of that British store island. I therefore welcome heckles, corrections, but most of all, suggestions of names of people I've left out. I hope through this interaction with you today and beyond today, we can help bolster this new partnership work, which Lynda and Catherine have just been spoken on, and advance the important work that Gifty has mentioned has been going on for the last couple of years in our region. Because the Empire Windrush landed in London, I would argue, the mother city of empire, but also the epicenter of slavery and imperialism, reaching Hull was not as easy or straightforward as you would imagine. Tilbury welcomed the Windrush when it arrived on the evening of the 21st of June 1948. Yet media hysteria surrounding the voyage of that famous vessel had mobilized the British state, including trade unions, politicians, and other interested parties in the establishment, to ensure that the practical support for the temporary housing of the newly arrived became an effective barrier for their speedy transit away from the capital. As other scholars, including Trevor Phillips, David Olasoga, and my good friend Gemma Romain have all detailed, the maltreatment of this first group of migrants from the Caribbean established a trend of impeding the dispersal of migrants beyond the capital. While socialite Nancy Cunard, who fought and championed anti-racism initiatives, travelled on Windrush and would have reached Paris with ease, as her passenger records detailed, because she was travelling in first-class carriages. Those in third class, in other words, those from the Caribbean, were grounded in London, struggling to find opportunities they'd imagined beyond London when they'd arrived at Tilbury. The places they'd wanted to go to were not just London, in case you've missed that point. If the passenger lists are to be believed, they were wanting to go to truly exotic places, as far north as the Firth of Forth, as far west as places in Ireland, Northern Ireland in particular, as far east as Norfolk, and as far north as the sunny delights of Yorkshire. The exotic destinations they wanted to go to are quite detailed and precise. They included Doncaster, Hull, Cleethorpes, and even Bridlington. But collectively, these destinations reveal that the Caribbean migrants arriving in Britain sought to move to different opportunities across the country. What then had stopped them? I would suggest the structures of inequality which had been mobilised against them. Rather than going across the country, settling in their new horizons and rekindling relationships that Gifty mentioned had been established during the Second World War, they were instead predominantly encouraged to settle in Britain's larger cities, Birmingham, Bristol, London and Nottingham. Had such governmental or other official interventions not take place, our island would have been truly a mosaic. But instead, interventions prevented that. Though the Windrush landed on arrived on the 21st of June, it was on the following day that immigration officials stamped the passenger lists of the 800 or so people on board the Windrush and detailed precisely where they wanted to go. Tilbury had been created to enable the speedy transit of discerning passengers to reach London's main railway termini at King's Cross, Euston and Waterloo. But in the case of Windrush, barriers were introduced which hindered their journey. So first slide, please. From the passenger records, what we've been able to ascertain is that glorious destinations in Yorkshire were also places where people such as Beresford, Nasrallah, who you can see on the top right of the screen, wished to venture to. 4 people have been identified so far on the first voyage from the Caribbean who wished to settle in the across Hull. 2, Frederick Black, aged 28, and an engineer from Jamaica, sought to go to an awful council estate. His friend, or was thinking his friend, Vincent Benjamin, aged 31, and a carpenter from Jamaica, was also bound to go nearby. The precise destination they wished to go to perhaps suggests that they were connected with some of the combatants who were based in nearby Cottingham during the Second World War. This may be guesswork, and it needs further investigation. Two other friends who were bound for Hull and told immigration officials where they wanted to go to were Glenville Daly, aged 22, a carpenter from Jamaica, and his friend, who we've seen on this image, Beresford Nasrallah, aged 23, a polisher, also from Jamaica. Interestingly, in this case, both were bound to the exact same address, 19 Peel Street, just off Springbank in Hull. And they were going far beyond the sailor town where most non-white people had gone before the Second World War. Others were going to other sunshine destinations, I'm joking here if you're not from Hull, including Doncaster, Cleethorpes and Scunthorpe. Next slide. So where did these migrants who were impeded actually go to? That's a good question. Beresford Nasrallah left his home in Kingston, Jamaica, and having travelled to Tilbury Dock after a month at sea, travelled to see his friend. And to quote his words, he came here to seek employment and to see the other side of the world. Yet he recalled on Windrush travelling alongside other people who were in the glorious Gloucesters on board and who were returning to their homeland. But he was travelling, according to his memoir, not to Hull, but to Nottingham. And so there is a vagary in the memory of the Windrush passengers. Where were they really travelling to? Are the passenger records correct? Did they misremember they weren't going to Nottingham, but instead further north to Hull? He further remembers he went to Nottingham and lodged with a kind English couple for a week, but then left for Kent. Police in Kent then directed him to the Clapham South Deep Air Raid Shelter, where 236 of those who'd arrived on the Windrush had been housed before dispersal across the country. Beresford eventually settled in Gloucester, with 15 others who were relocated from Clapham South. They were all obtained accommodation in a nearby hostel and were issued with ration books because they had arrived when rationing still continued. Finally, he secured a job with British Railway. He'd gone from being a polisher in Jamaica to a member of the British Rail staff in England. But it shows the willingness and contribution which many people, such as Beresford, contributed not to Hull, but to Britain as a story. Such testimony reveals the many gaps, particularly concerning memory, in the story of Windrush. Many people have told us the positive stories, or, as Catherine and Lynda have just mentioned, some of the negative aspects. But why that so far is the story of Hull's connection of these northern destinations being airbrushed from the story of the Windrush passengers and those who followed in the Windrush generation. Whilst I've not been able to ascertain what happened to the other three who settled in this region so far, because this is work in progress, we wish to allocate or identify those who came after the Windrush, whether they were also coming to Hull or to other places, or how increasingly the state was limiting their choices of where they settled and forcing them to live in London and the big cities. The people coming on the Windrush were not the only people from the Caribbean who sought to establish a new home in Hull. Despite the institutional barriers erected to prevent the settlement of Caribbean migrants, a small number of other migrants established home in here. How they reached here varied. Some people who'd arrived earlier, like Clive Sullivan's Antiguan grandfather, arrived through Cardiff and then, famously through Clive, who's shown on the left, played rugby for Hull FC, Hull KR, and then played for Britain, the first black captain of a sporting team when he played for rugby. Clive thus arrived indirectly, but his family had arrived before even the Second World War, predating what Gifty has just told us. Other people who'd arrived did not come here during the war, but just after the war. If you look in the bottom middle of this image, you see the first black Vice-Chancellor of a British university, Roy Marshall, later Sir Roy Marshall, who came to study law at Cambridge, and then, having graduated, helped draft the Barbadian Constitution when it gained independence from Britain in 1966, before he eventually became Vice-Chancellor here at the university. Thus, as Lynda, Catherine and Gifty have all highlighted, the adaptability and of the migrants to engage with new pursuits and highlighting new skills demonstrates just how qualified and capable the Windrush generation was to making an active contribution to Britain and further afield. Other people who came in the region include Cecile Oxell, who I'm privileged to call a good friend, who's in the audience today, who fights as part of the Amnesty International to spread freedom in our region today. People of dual heritage, like our own Karen Okra, of Jamaican descent, contribute towards the Freedom Festival and the cultural celebration here in the city. Yet other people have slipped under the radar, often because they've moved on. The gentleman in the top of this image in the middle was a triple graduate of the University of Hull, securing a BA in Economic and Social History, an MA in Economic and Social History, before a PhD in Economic and Social History. One of our arguably most illustrious alumnus of the university, he's a fellow Barbadian, perhaps inspired by Roy's stewardship of the university. Sir Hilary Beckles now leads the is Vice-Chancellor of the University of West Indies, but crucially champions the CARICOM reparations for the slave trade. And therefore, individuals continue to contribute to British society and to societies where they've come from too. But often, some people would have been documented in some of the scant scholarship to do with the story of Caribbean migrants in our region too. The local historian and maritime expert, Alec Gill, had written about a man locally known as Nick the Cook, shown in this far image on the right, who'd come here during the war, as Gifty mentioned, but not as a member of the aircrew, but instead as a soldier. When he was demobbed, he stayed locally and entered into the trawling industry at Hull. And through the help of a local leader of a fishing fleet, Tommy Boyd, he'd secured local employment. Although that sounds a success story, when he faced prejudice, he used his skills and knowledge and acumen to help prevent that spreading further. And if you want to know further, I suggest you read Nick the Cook by Alec Gill, because it's a very good yarn. Next slide, please. Yet the Windrush story did have more deeper links with our region, stories that we're trying to desperately seek out as part of our project. We're trying to identify these stories, partly because they were also the victims of the injustices of the Windrush generation. Only 2 days ago, Callum Hanrahan, a local lawyer, identified the plight of an individual who was unnamed, who is continuing to fight injustice today. An individual who came with his family in 1970 from the Caribbean as part of that Caribbean diaspora, as part of the Windrush generation, contributed actively to British life, enlisting for several decades in the British Armed Services. When he was demobbed, or when he finished finally his period of service, he then faced uncertainty recently, and he's fighting to retain the right to stay in Britain. He, like many of the Windrush generation, having spent an entire life demonstrating active loyalty to Britain, and now fighting for the basic right to remain here rather than being deported. Thankfully, local experts and local lawyers like Hanrahan are continuing to support individuals who face these injustices and show that Hull's ability to stand up against injustice was strong. So to conclude, Hull has been a home to people from the Caribbean since at least the 19th century, if not before. Local census enumerators reports noted people born on most Caribbean islands in the 19th century, including Barbados, Jamaica, Belize, and St. Kitts, just to cheer Catherine up there. Most were no doubt mariners who stopped over, those who married here, local lasses, and then had children. Others were encouraged to come here as part of various work schemes or the Empire settlement era. But it was only when Britain invited non-white migrants en masse to come here that resentment grew. Thankfully, racism in Hull has not been as bad as other areas in Britain, but it was still an ugly stain on the city's past. Many scholars, though, nationally and locally, have questioned the problem of being fixated upon Windrush, and I don't wish to give the example here today that Windrush, one vessel, was the entire story. Yet to me, the passenger manifest that I've examined today reveals the shape and character of the migrants and the potential they could have influenced across Britain had institutional structures against their migration not come to their fore before the vessel even arrived on the 21st of June, 1948. Those coming here, I would argue, were as British as fish and chips, or as Marks and Spencer, or even the Mini Cooper. They were all educated in the English education system, fiercely loyal to the British Crown, willing to stand up to Britain during her hour of need, and very religious Christians. What differentiated them? Race. Ensured that their injustice remains unfinished business to this very day. Something we hope, with your help, we can eventually start to remedy and repair. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. That was really informative, and obviously it just goes to show that there's a lot of people who have come from the Caribbean and the next generation. And I'd just like to say at this point as well, the late Hobby Sabin, who was one of the founders of the whole Caribbean Association, and many more, Mr. Excel. I'd just like to now at this point just say that we are open to questions. If anybody wants to post them, it's on the right side of the function on the right side of your screen. Before we go to closing remarks by Aneesa. So I welcome the panel back and thank you. And people want to post the questions, or if they've not already, and I'll hand you back over to Nick, who will take those questions and distribute them to the panel accordingly. Because I'm not so good at the technical side of things. So thank you, Nick.
Don't worry, Karen. I'll do my best. Okay, so we've had a couple of questions that come in. I guess, well, I'll start by asking one of my own. So Gifty, on your fascinating paper, I wonder if you could explain a little bit about the methodology of how you're recovering the story of these combatants. And certainly in my past, I've tried to look for some of them and failed quite dismally. So how are you trying to recover all these names of people?
It is difficult. Part of it is Forces war records, but that's not always complete, and sometimes it's a case of cross-referencing, knowing roughly the service numbers and trying to match it accordingly, because of course not everybody from the Caribbean would have necessarily been of African descent, which is what our focus is. So that makes it rather complicated. Yeah, it's also sort of hazarding a guess at names as well, the sort of name patterns perhaps, but there is no central records, and that's what makes it so tricky, and that's what makes it so hard to find these men, and that's what makes it so laborious and time-consuming in ensuring that we've captured the right cohort of men. On today's entry, we're trying to put something out every week to add to the huge list that we're compiling. And we do acknowledge that whilst we know that, for example, we've split the cohorts into the first contingents and the second contingents. And most of the second contingents we know because by some good grace, they tended to leave Jamaica to go to America first, they landed in America, and then from America they came here. So there's a vessel called the SS Cuba, for example, that has the passenger list. So we're able to be quite confident that we've captured those cohorts. The first contingent is rather more complicated because it's not quite as straightforward as that. So it is a lot of cross-checking, and it's taken, and I have to say it's mainly Audrey that I work with that has spent hours trudging through it and contributing quite substantially. So I don't work alone, I certainly don't. I tend to focus on the story side. And yeah, so with every help I get, and occasionally it's getting quite good now, because a lot of families spot their relative on the list now and ask us what we know about it. And unfortunately, we don't know a great deal other than them listed as a name. So then we ask to try and get their stories from what they know to get an insight of the people that they were.
Oh, that's great. Thanks.
It's difficult, in other words.
I was going to say there's a lot of hard work to be done there, so well done to Audrey too. Yeah, a linked question to that has come in from Charlotte Pettit. She asks, Gifty, are there many instances of Caribbean combatants receiving medals during the war? So did a lot of the people get medals?
There are. Yeah, there's recognition, but we haven't actually listed that as part of the list. We just wanted to keep it simple as a roll of honour. But oftentimes, many people that serve tend to have found themselves in precarious situations. I mean, there wasn't just the ground crew, it was the air crew as well, of course, the 400 or so that came before the main bulk of ground crew. And yes, many of them were decorated. The ground crew tended to come towards the end of the war, but still there was some involvement.
Thank you. It's really interesting. And I was thinking certainly there's some graveyards that I've not yet been to with some of those combatants who died as well. So I'll put that on my to-do list. Okay, so a question for Catherine and for Lynda from Judith Spixley. Was there a particular event that pushed you to set up Museumand, or was it just a series of things that motivated you to do such positive work?
Well, it was an event way back in 1997 when the government introduced the new educational system of designating children as being either underachievers or gifted and talented. And the first year, everybody was treated equally, I felt. As a teacher, I was a secondary school teacher teaching English, and I thought that was fine the first year. Second and third years, I just realised more and more underachievers were black children, and I realised, well, I could smell a rat there, and so I decided to do something about it. But you know, sometimes teachers are powerless for making great change. So I had to wait till I retired, and when I retired, I said I will do something about it. I will find all the great achievements that black people have done, and then I'll go and say to black kids, no, you're not underachieving. It's just you're being held back. And here are all the other people who suffered other traumatic experiences, but they did well, and so will you. So that's my job, to empower.
Yeah, thank you. Very, 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 very inspiring. That was very, 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 very good response there. I'm really inspired by that. And for anyone else who's got any further questions, we have got some to work through. But if you do have any further questions, then please use the tab key on the right-hand side of the screen. To if you click on it and ask the questions, then we'll be able to ask your questions too. Okay. So, question from Susan Capes. She asks, what can be done to ensure that more pupils learn about the Windrush story than do at present in British schools?
Right. Well, two things. Well, come and support our programme while we're in Hull. But what we do is we produce a list of resources that teachers can use. We use other means. One of the things that parents had to do when our children were designated as educationists of normal, we set up what were called Saturday schools. Then they became posh and were called supplementary schools, and then they got another posh name, and so on. But look what's happened in the rest of society. We now have homework clubs. But at the time when we were doing that, we were told, you're working your children too hard. Children need to be playing after school. They don't need. And now look, you've got homework clubs, and they're done in libraries, and there's some really good high street learning centres nowadays.
Not just, before you carry on, that just goes back to everything that we do first. We're always, you know, told that why we're doing that, we're over the top, it's not needed, we're always looked down on. And then again, cultural appropriation. Everybody's doing it as if like, we've been doing this forever. No, you haven't. You watch what we did and how our children were then starting to achieve, and then you want to get and be part of that.
And we don't mind being copied. We just want to be credited.
Yeah.
Copy us, but credit us.
Don't forget us.
Thank you. So Jeff Morgan makes the point that he comments from the audience, I knew Sir Roy Marshall quite well when I was medical officer at Hull University during his tenure. Not only did he guide this Hull institution with great insight, but he later became even more influential as secretary to the National Advisory Panel of Vice Chancellors. So thanks, Jeff, for that good comment. I think that must be why he was knighted at some point. We don't have many Vice Chancellors who've been knighted, which is quite interesting. Anyway, I'm not going to rant about that one. The question comes in, I guess, to everyone, all of us. Are there any, from Glynis and Eslam, are there any stories about Caribbean women who came over to this area? So to any of you, I don't know, Lynda, Catherine, did you want to start that one?
I haven't had any stories yet about Caribbean women. No, I haven't. But I've had stories of Caribbean men who got into relationships with local women. And those stories are what I want to look into. I want to know which bits of culture they were able to, I was going to say latch on, but I don't mean that. I mean use. What did their partners teach them that they then carried on doing that are now part of their whole life? Yeah. I think we'll find some interesting things.
Well, I think once we are starting to work in Hull, and once we actually get up to Hull and not just do things through virtual means, we will be finding those stories out. It's amazing the stories that we have been finding out from other parts of the country when we work nationally. I don't think we've said we're a Museumand, but we're a museum without walls, which means we don't have a building. We work in other people's places and spaces, from places like the V&A all the way down to shopping centres, church halls, that sort of thing. So we do work with all sorts of sizes of organisations. And we do find out loads of interesting little tidbits of information that I've never heard of before, and I know my history and my heritage, and I love that sort of thing, hence working in it. But it's amazing things we do find out from all sorts of people as well. So again, like I was saying, just because you may not see lots of black or brown faces in Hull on the streets, there'll be lots of stories that other people will know, like Catherine was saying, that they've been told from friends, family over the years, that's just in their memory, back in their memory, they haven't probably even forgotten about. But once they share about it, we will find out those stories.
That's where the English cup of tea is going to come in really handy. When we can all meet up again, we all have a cup of tea,
and a slice of cake,
and all the stories will flow.
No, exactly. It's a very good point there, Catherine, though, when we can have a good old natter, we can remember these stories. And certainly, I think to answer your question from my perspective, Glynis, certainly even on Windrush, there was gender parity. And so I think that's often ignored. There were a lot of attention's often paid to the male migrants who were on those vessels, but there were a lot of women too. However, I couldn't find any coming to our region, which is quite interesting about that gendered nature of migration too. But the miscarriage of justice chap at the end, who we don't know the name of, his wife and children came with him from the Caribbean. And so I think that's quite interesting there, that you've got a full familial migration in the 1970s, just before the Commonwealth Immigration Act, limited migration. So Gifty, was there anything you wanted to contribute to that story?
Certainly in terms of females on the African stories, the females in history are often hidden, more so than being black and female makes it even more so. So even not necessarily looking at the Windrush generation or the Caribbean stories, but generally as a bank of archives in the African stories, there aren't as disproportionately, it's mainly male, but there are some stories, if you talk about wartime, there's that of Lillian Barder, but that's not necessarily, that was pre-Windrush, if you like, because that was generations on. But yes, to answer Glynis's question, women are often forgotten because their stories are deemed as somewhat unimportant. But that's something that needs to be rectified, clearly.
And I think I'd add on to that, Glynis, if you look at the fantastic book by Gemma Romain, the front of the book cover shows you a female clippy, the female contribution to London's transport industry. So there's a lot of contributions in her book which identify women and remedy that bias that that Gifty's just mentioned there. So it's very pertinent. Okay, our next question is coming from Trevor Bernard. So he said it's for Gifty. He said, Gifty, my father-in-law served in the RAF in this region between 1944 and 1945. His service, among other things, opened his eyes to a wider world of people. Some things he's often mentioned as someone who other than in the war, lived in a small place in a small island, a small island town in New Zealand. Did you find out how much the West Indian Airmen had interactions with other airmen? Sorry, just got the rest of this question. And other servicemen from other parts of the Caribbean and from the United States, especially perhaps white Southern Americans too.
This was quite a problematic area in that a lot of the stories we get are anecdotal, and that's what we're collecting. But certainly, because, as I mentioned, the administrators were told 10% of the unit was to have Caribbean recruits, they would have been spread quite throughout the land in terms of camps. So I expect that many people did, other recruits from the home nations did encounter Caribbean recruits as well. There was the issue of the Americans coming over where segregation was commonplace for them, but they had to find ways of turning their thoughts around in a way, because that didn't happen here. So there was many instances of fracas between Caribbean recruits who encountered the Americans, who objected to them being served, say, in a pub, where they were somewhat unfamiliar with that sort of concept in their own homeland. So there was a lot of incidences where locals or the white British armed forces people would intervene and protect the Caribbeans because of the prejudice exhibited on them by the Americans. So, but wartime, I think that's probably why there's a lot of positive recollections of, because people saw it as it was precarious, but it was, in a way, if I could describe it as fun. Certainly, a lot of the stories that we get, a lot of the men will say it was a great time of their lives, because it was an adventure. It was an opportunity to mix with other people, and it was, as we all revisit some of our school days or university years as perfect, it was never so, but often because of things that happened that were positive, people reflect on them quite positively. And I think for many, they enjoyed that encounter with people from all nations. And of course, there was many colonies, so they would have encountered many people from different nations.
Okay, thank you. We've got a question from Judith for you as well, Gifty, on that. Did many servicemen stay on and use their trades after the war had ended?
Yes, that's what we're finding actually in some of the stories. They would have learnt skills. So, for example, we've got a couple on the stories of people that trained as welders within, as part of their ground crew training, that went on to then do welding qualifications so that they could use their transferable skills in Civiland, you know. So yes, those skills were transferable, and I think that's where they saw that there was more opportunity. They had encountered the possibility of other trades whilst they were in the forces, and they wanted to use that. So the frustration was when some of them were repatriated back to the Caribbean, there wasn't that opportunity to use it. So when they were called again, it became a release, an opportunity to forward their education and develop those skills. So yes, it was a case of acquiring skills that they could then use.
Okay, thank you very much. And final question, I guess, to Karen, since she's been quiet and silent here. Karen, how important is it to you as a person from Hull that we increasingly engage with the work of Gifty and of Museumand in trying to raise awareness about diversity?
I think it's really important, and for I guess some of the people that are on this webinar and who maybe see this have heard me say this before. Growing up as one of two families of dual heritage on a council estate from the age of 10, so most of my life, and one of three families from a single parent, was quite hard. Now, as we was talking, as I was listening to Gifty and to Lynda-Louise and Catherine and yourself, it just made me think that the other family was Mr. Etzel, and the Etzel family, he then went on to, so he came across as a Windrush generation, and he went on to join in the Merchant Navy and spent many years going around the world, probably hardly ever going back to the West Indies, and just kept coming back to Hull. But growing up, I never felt fully accepted. I felt starved of my identity. So I've never felt fully accepted as white, and I've never felt fully accepted as black. And the work that Gifty's doing, and Lynda-Louise and Catherine, is really important, because I think for me, it's that story needs to be told, because we talk about the history of slavery, and the work that the whole university does and WISE is really important, and we talk about modern day slavery. And as Hull, growing up, the Wilberforce Monument, which Gifty in the African project, were campaigning to have it lit up. I grew up thinking it was a miniature version of Nelson's column. Never knew anything about Wilberforce, this great man who was part of our history, and obviously it's different now. But we have to think about what happened in history shapes us how we are today, and what we do now, we're making history. And so, like Lynda-Louise and Catherine said, we have to tell the full story. There's always two sides to the story. And a lot of people like Cecile Oxel, the late Horace Irving, even, people who are in, a lot of people who are in youth work, which I do now, and you might hear, some young people in the background in the hall. A lot of people in youth work now, and today working with young people, trying to make a difference in terms of identity, inclusion, making everybody feel a part of something. A lot of them are from Jamaican descent, or from the Caribbean, should I say. And I just think that it's not until now that I thought of that, and I thought of other people being from that, because we've just had to get on with it and just be who we are. So I think it's really important, and I think the work that you're all doing, and it's not just one person, it's from all different directions and approaches, are going to make a lot of difference. These stories need to be told, and when we look as well, I'll just finish, but you wish you'd never said this, Nick, but when we look at a lot of the prisons and, the prisoners and people of different diverse backgrounds, the people of Caribbean and American descent are the people who are at the bottom end of the, I don't like to say pecking order, but they're right at the bottom end of how society accepts them and includes them. And yeah, there's challenges there, but thank you. It's important.
No, very important thing to end on there, Karen. So thanks. And I think it's incredibly important too, Karen, that we also remember the voices that you represent, because you are of this Caribbean descent community in Hull. And so it's giving you a voice that really we hope these projects will achieve. So if anyone's listening in the audience and didn't get a chance to ask a question, or would like to get involved with the project, then please get in touch with any of us, and we can guide you to how to get in touch with individual. I'd probably suggest Googling Museumand, and you can find their connections and connect with Double Trouble, as I call them, Lynda and Catherine. So it's we have got, if you've enjoyed what we've discussed this evening, both the good and the bad parts of discussing this very painful subject, we've got 2 more events coming up in the next few weeks, which you may wish to join in. Next month, or sorry, in 28th to the 29th of June, so next week, is the 50th anniversary of the publication of Richard Dunn's book on sugar and slaves that really changed the shape of and nature of Caribbean historiography. And so that's an event jointly organised with our colleagues in Philadelphia, the McNeil Centre. And so we're not hosting that, which are a relief to those behind the scenes like Judith, Claire and I, who normally do this technical support. So that's a joint 2-day workshop based on American time, so it's a little bit later than normal for us. And you can see there the URL, or just look on our web page or our social media sites. Next month, we're going to have one of our Wilberforce debates where we bring along lots of scholars who are working on a particular area. And this time, our director, Trevor Bernard, is chairing events looking at why Massachusetts, particularly Boston, Massachusetts, has been a particular area for discussion on slavery. But recently, and so we've got a huge plethora of scholars, including our own Trevor, Gerard, Shemaine, Mark, Gloria, and Margaret, who are on the screen here, and so that's bound to be a good discussion too. Okay, but anyway, now after all of those different introductions and comments, we conclude by passing over for final reflections by Councillor Aneesa Akbar. She's the portfolio holder at Hull City Council for communities. So it's particularly relevant that we can conclude our events today by returning to someone who's inspired us recently to champion racism in the city. Over to you, Councillor Akbar.
Thank you so much. That's really touching what you said, but actually everyone on this call has really inspired me over well, since I met you, especially Double Trouble, as you like to call them, who have been amazing. I will pick up on one point though. You talked about cultural appropriation. Isn't it English cup of tea? Do you know what I mean? Like, anyway. But I just want to say that it's been really inspiring to hear the talks today, and I'm sure that people that have attended will agree. And I think it's actually been really emotional hearing the stories today as well. So being on Twitter, and I love Diane Abbott, and I just love the way in which she talks about, you know, Black history as a whole, and just, you know, the stories that she's been sharing today, just a pure inspiration. And also, as we remember the good, as has been said, we also need to remember that if we ignore those aspects of institutional racism, imperialism, colonialism, then we're only ever going to repeat the Windrush scandal, which was, you know, an absolute stain on our recent history. But, you know, it should never ever be repeated, and we should always recognise that contribution that people make, and make sure that we're looking at history, you know, in its whole, and rooting it within the individual and collective experience that people go through. So I'm also just really thrilled as well. I didn't know that we had, you know, the Peel Street stories, Nick, that you sort of shared, and it's. I'm going to have a look at number 19 and see. Can't even get my words out now. But see who's in there now. But but it just shows, as you were saying about. Springbank is often seen as like, oh, recent, you know, immigration, and that's what's happened. But actually, when you look at sort of the pockets or the areas in your city, and see that mosaic, I love that word, by the way, like seeing the mosaics within your city, it's really inspiring, and it just encourages you to learn a bit more. And just, I guess, like on the sort of final points, like, you know, we do have as a council, you know, we have supported the whole Afro-Caribbean Association, and having, you know, the building and being able to support Freedom Fest. I'm really pleased that our libraries and museums are, you know, also supporting the work that is going on locally. But there's always more that needs to be done and can be done. And I think, you know, part of this conversation that we're having in the city at the minute needs to be about, you know, how as an institution that we're able to support the telling of these stories. You know, so I'm really glad that we're starting that, or we're moving this forward, you know, with the project that is going to be coming forward. So yes, I'm really inspired. I can't wait to see what's going to be going on throughout the year, and just thank you for allowing me to speak today.
Thank you, and thanks to everybody who's spoken today, and thanks to Karen for chairing and keeping us to time. So it's very good, and thanks to everybody who's taken part. We look forward to seeing you in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.